Hey everybody, welcome to what was originally supposed to be the second review of Request Month 2026, but things have obviously not gone according to plan on that, both in terms of Request Month itself and this particular video. Now, I'll talk more about the Request Month stuff at the end of the video after I've talked about the game in question for this video, but obviously the original intent behind this video was to do a full review of the game in question, which is of course the original Metroid, which was of course a first-party Nintendo game that was originally released for the Famicom Disk System back in 1986, but then got released for the NES and Famicom, which is the Japanese version of the NES, in 1987. And of course that NES version is not only what you'll be seeing throughout this video, but it's the version that pretty much everyone is actually familiar with. After all, as successful as the Famicom Disk System was in Japan, it never released anywhere else, so nobody's really familiar with that version outside of Japan, and it's not really that different from the NES version anyway. Since the game's original release, it has been re-released numerous times on a variety of systems. There was the likes of the Game Boy Advance release, which was part of a whole initiative of re-releasing classic NES games on that system. There's of course the Virtual Console versions for the likes of Wii and Wii U. Then of course there's the likes of the NES Classic Edition, which is actually the version you're going to be seeing throughout this video. And as of recording, the most widely available version of the game right now is the Switch Online version, where if you have a Nintendo Switch Online subscription, you can access a whole host of NES games, and Metroid happens to be one of them. Now, the original Metroid does occupy a bit of a weird space, not only in the franchise, but in gaming as a whole, because it is generally considered a legendary title, one of the best games ever made, that kind of thing. But when people talk about Metroid, they're usually not talking about the original game. They're usually talking about Super Metroid, which is actually the third game in the series. The second game actually released on the Game Boy, but the third game released on the SNES, and it was the one that really solidified Metroid as a franchise. It established the gameplay style that would persist to this day with the likes of Metroid Dread, and would serve as the basis of the spin-off series Metroid Prime, which is actually what tends to get requested on my channel more often than not, because obviously I tend to play a lot more first-person shooters and don't really play a whole lot of platformers. But if I'm going to be covering Metroid Prime, I need to cover the games leading up to it, at least the major ones. So more specifically, I definitely need to cover the original game and Super Metroid before I get to even the original Metroid Prime. Basically, you need to know what the series is coming from to know where it ends up. This presents me with a bit of a conundrum, because I don't particularly care for platformers. I never really liked the genre all that much to begin with, but over the years I just played so many of the games that I managed to burn myself out on the entire genre. So these days when I go and mess around with any platformers, I generally have a very difficult time getting into them, and more often than not, the general expression I have is, yep, that sure is a platformer, alright. That's not to say that I can't recognize when they do things well versus when they don't do things well, but it just means I don't usually cover platformers very much on the channel. If I do, it's usually in a DW Plays format, because there's just not all that much for me to say about most of them. I can't really do that with the original Metroid though, because it's a foundational title for basically an entire genre, fittingly called the Metroidvania genre. Although I wouldn't really say it's a genre in and of itself, it's more of a subtype that gets applied to a variety of genres, most commonly 2D platformers, although obviously not exclusively. There are, say, first-person Metroidvanias, like, of course, Metroid Prime, but also stuff like, say, Power Slave, also known as Exhumed. So I feel at least obligated to do reviews, or something akin to a review of at least the original Metroid and Super Metroid, because they are foundational titles for this entire subtype of game. But apart from those two, I don't know, we'll see. Anyway, point is, I decided that I needed to at least try to do a full review of the original Metroid and Super Metroid, so we're getting to the original Metroid now, and now we run into a few other problems. The first of these problems is that I have absolutely no nostalgia for this game whatsoever. I never played it back in the day, and in fact, I never played it until I got my NES Classic Edition a few years ago. You see, for some more context there, the very first Nintendo system I ever actually had was a Game Boy Advance, followed shortly by a GameCube. So I never had an NES, and I never had an SNES, so I never played the original Metroid or Super Metroid back in the day. The very first Metroid game I ever actually played was Prime. And I don't want to go too far into what happened with that back in the day, but suffice to say, I didn't really play a whole lot of the original Metroid Prime back when it was still new. So Metroid is one of those franchises that I had to go back and rediscover what the originals were like, without any kind of nostalgia blunting the impact of any issues that they might have. And this is ultimately going to be the big crux of my video here, because the vast majority of videos you see on the internet will tell you that the original Metroid is just this wonderful game, that it's legendary, that it's one of those all-time classics, and pretty much everybody who's saying that played it back in the day. They have nostalgia for it, and while there's nothing wrong with being nostalgic for something, it does affect the way you assess a particular game. If you're nostalgic for something, you're a lot more willing to overlook any kind of rough edges it has, any kind of control problems it might have, things like that. And a really weird thing about Nintendo games is that people are more than happy to criticize modern releases, but they'll give a free pass to pretty much everything that released on NES, SNES, and to a somewhat lesser degree, N64. And while that might be fine if you're only interested in a particular game for, say, its historical value, it's really unhelpful for people who are looking for a more objective assessment about what the game actually is and whether it's worth picking up and playing, because they don't only need to know what the game's legacy is or what it does particularly well, they need to know what it doesn't do well, so that they know what they have to overcome in order to be able to enjoy it, if it's even possible for them to enjoy it in the first place. And generally speaking, I try to take that perspective more into account when I assess these older titles like this. Because while I have plenty of experience playing games from this era, a lot of people these days don't really understand what games used to be like, because they're so used to modern games that hold their hand all the time, that have all of the story contained in the game itself, that have cutscenes and tutorials and things like that, so they really don't know what they're getting themselves into with a lot of these older titles. And my hope is that with a more objective look at the games like I try to do, it might help better prepare someone for jumping into a game like this, or help them understand that it really may not be the kind of game for them. And so with an idea of how I try to look at things in mind, understand that when I jumped into this game, I already had a general idea of what to expect from it, because I have played plenty of platformers from this era, several of which are in fact NES games. For example, I have reviewed Castlevania 1, 2, and 3 on my channel, and while the experience was quite rough, those were in fact full reviews. I had finished those games. But even being prepared for the kinds of shenanigans that 1980s platformers get up to, I still couldn't force myself through the entire thing in order to be able to review it. Which might sound weird to those of you who have actually played through this game already, because a lot of you know that the game can be beaten in about 2 hours if you know what you're doing, and obviously speedrunners got that down to less than 10 minutes at this point, which is ridiculous. But regardless, it's not an especially long game, nor is it cited among the more difficult games in the NES library. You'll usually see the likes of course, the Castlevania games, which, again, I have done reviews on, as well as the likes of, say, Ninja Gaiden. And the really funny thing about that is, Metroid is actually a more difficult game than those, for a few very specific reasons. You see, the likes of Castlevania and Ninja Gaiden are difficult because they're just difficult platformers in general. They operate on 80s arcade design principles that were designed to get as many quarters out of the player as possible, so they'll do things like require the player to make obnoxiously precise jumps, or just memorize enemy placements and enemy movement and attack patterns in order to be able to beat them. And so most of their design really revolves around building up muscle memory of how to actually move and attack enemies, as well as just knowledge of what enemies you're going to be facing and what kind of platforming challenges you're going to be facing. The original Metroid also follows these design principles, but it follows a very different structure than those other games. You see, when you look at the likes of, say, a Castlevania game, it is a very linear progression. You have Stage 1, then you have Stage 1-2, or Stage 1-3. Eventually you get to the end of the stage, you fight a boss, you move on to the next stage. You just continue doing this throughout the entire game until eventually you get to the end boss and then you win. This is how the vast majority of platformers at the time the original Metroid released were designed. And so the process of building up muscle memory with all of the different movements, as well as the knowledge of what you'll be facing, is a rather straightforward process. Everything is pretty clearly delineated. But Metroid isn't like that. Its progression is considerably less linear. It's not exactly non-linear because there is a very specific progression you have to go through in order to be able to beat the game, but as long as you have the right abilities, you can go wherever you want. So instead of a linear stage-based progression, you are presented with multiple interconnected areas that you can go back and forth between, and you're expected to wander around the map, find the different abilities that will allow you to access new areas, go into those new areas, find the abilities that will allow you to access other areas, and then just continue to repeat this process until you get to the end of the game. That is the core design principle of what would ultimately become the Metroidvania playstyle. And while it made the original Metroid very unique in its day, it also introduced a host of other problems. You see, when you look at contemporary linear platformers, they're usually pretty simple and straightforward. You have a basic left-right movement with a jump mechanic, usually with the ability to crouch as well, although not every game allowed you to move while crouching. And with NES platformers, you had two face buttons, so that usually meant you had one reserved for jumping and one reserved for whatever your attack was. And if you did have any kind of additional attacks or moves you could do, it would be through a combination of D-pad movements and the attack button. For example, with Castlevania, you would hold up on the D-pad while pressing the attack button to use your sub-weapon. Like I said, all very simple, straightforward, very easy to pick up and play. It's just that mastering these mechanics would take some effort. Metroid, on the other hand, was a fair bit more complicated because you had numerous different abilities that you had to switch between in order to be able to progress and in order to be able to defeat certain enemy types. You still have one of your face buttons being jump and the other one being attack, but you can also hold up on the D-pad while pressing the attack button in order to shoot upwards. You can't shoot at a diagonal angle in the original game, however, and you can't even crouch and then shoot left or right. You can't crouch at all, in fact. If you press down on the D-pad, it does nothing starting out the game, but once you get access to the Morph Ball ability, pressing down on the D-pad turns you into the Morph Ball. This allows you to move through spaces you couldn't normally access, but also leaves you completely defenseless until later on in the game when you do get an ability that allows you to defend yourself. This means that until you unlock that ability, the only thing you can do to enemies that are lower than where your arm cannon can shoot left or right is try to jump over them. Now, it's not really a huge problem in and of itself, it's just more of a mild annoyance than anything else, but something you'll understand very quickly as far as the original Metroid is concerned is that its issues compound on each other. So while in isolation, not being able to crouch and shoot at enemies on the ground isn't really a big deal, you're not going to be running into it in isolation. Instead, you're going to run into a room and there's going to be enemies that are crawling along the walls, the ceiling, and the floor, and while you're able to shoot the enemies that are crawling along the vertical walls some of the time, depending on where they're positioned, and you're able to shoot enemies on the ceiling if you can jump high enough to do that, you can't shoot enemies on the floor. So you're just having to try to jump over them, which in turn exposes you to enemies that are either flying down at you from the ceiling, or they're flying horizontally at you, or they're doing a combination of both. Now, this also is not really a problem in and of itself. In fact, to most of you, it probably sounds like pretty standard platformer design, until you start factoring in the health and damage systems. You see, Samus's health is represented by the energy meter, which maxes out at 99 points. This means that at the start of the game you have a maximum of 99 health, and then as you continue to progress, you will eventually start finding energy tanks that will allow you to collect an additional 100 units of energy per energy tank that you've collected. So basically, when your current energy tank hits 0, then you move on to the next one until eventually you have only the energy tank, for lack of a better way of describing it, that you started the game with, which means that you have the last 99 hit points available. And as you play through the game and you start taking damage, you can restore your lost energy by collecting energy orbs that enemies will drop. Most of the time, they will drop energy orbs that will only give you 5 points of energy, but some of the more powerful enemies will drop orbs that will contain 20 points of energy. And that probably all sounds quite sensible and maybe even standard if you're used to a lot of platformers like, say, the Mega Man series, which have somewhat similar health mechanics. But then there are two aspects of it that become particularly frustrating. The first is the kind of damage you will be taking as you play through the game. You see, in most platformers that are considered decent, not even necessarily good, just decent ones, whenever you take damage, there is a very brief period of invulnerability until you can take damage again. It's usually only a few frames, but it's usually just enough time to be able to get out of the way of whatever is attacking you. Metroid kind of has this in the sense that whenever you take damage, there's about 1 or 2 frames where you will not continue to take damage, but that's not enough time to get away from whatever's hitting you because of how slow Samus moves and how fast the enemies can move. This means that far more often than not, when you do take damage from enemies, you not only end up taking quite a bit more damage than you were really anticipating, but it also is quite frustrating because you're trying to get away from the enemy and you just kind of can't. And in instances like that, it basically turns combat into a battle of attrition. It's either your health bottoms out or you manage to defeat the enemy. The other instance in which this becomes very frustrating is when you fall into a hazard and you just continually take damage from that hazard until you're able to jump out of it. And even in those instances, a lot of times you'll still get hit by enemies trying to jump out of the hazard. And this is all frustrating enough on its own. But then there's the one thing that really drags this entire mechanical system down. And that is that regardless of whether you are starting a new game or using the continue feature, you are jumping into the game with 30 energy points. And this is regardless of how many energy tanks you've collected. You just start with 30 energy points. Period. And if you want to give yourself an actual fighting chance and get your energy up to maximum, you're going to have to find a spot where enemies respawn easily and just sit there farming energy orbs until eventually you've managed to max out your energy. And while that's irritating enough when you only have the one energy bar maxing out at 99, but when you start adding energy tanks on top of that you need to fill up, it just drags that process out further, and the more energy tanks you add, the more it drags everything out. And keep in mind that during this process, if somehow you mess something up, you'll take damage from the enemies you're trying to farm energy from, so you'll end up lengthening the process even more. It is a legitimately baffling way of handling a health system in any game, let alone a platformer, even for the time that this game released back in 1986. Even other legendarily difficult platformers of the era would spawn you with full health if they even had a health system at all. Whereas Metroid just says, yeah, you either grind or you get good. It is a prime example of artificial difficulty, and quite literally the only reason I can think of that they would implement something like this is to simply pad out the game's length. I mean, that was an extremely common arcade game design principle at the time. You artificially increase the difficulty to pad out the game's length, because if you didn't artificially pad out the game's length with that difficulty, the game would be incredibly short. And unfortunately, Metroid really does meet that criterion, because when you look at the game's length between someone who knows what they're doing playing it and someone who is just starting the game for the first time, the difference in playtimes is pretty massive. You're talking about a game that's maybe 4 to 6 hours long for someone who doesn't know what they're doing and hasn't ever really played it before, versus somewhere around 1 to 2 hours for someone who does know what they're doing. And becoming someone who knows what they're doing when playing this game is a very frustrating road. For one, you have the simple fact that most of the environments look pretty much exactly the same, so it is very difficult to tell exactly where you are and where you're going, unless of course you have a map that you can operate from, but this game doesn't include a map feature, so any map that you have is going to be external, whether you just look up a map of the game, or you are just taking notes as you go along and maybe using grid paper or something like that. On top of this, there isn't a save feature where you can just go to a save point or save anywhere, hop out of the game, hop back into it, and pick up where you left off. Instead, whenever you die, the game gives you a continue code that you need to write down and then re-enter on the main menu with the continue option if you want to pick up more or less where you left off. It's still not going to be exactly where you left off. It'll probably be a room or two behind where you were, maybe even several rooms behind where you were, but it does retain your major progress, which will be things like the amount of energy tanks you've found, the various suit upgrades you've found, the different abilities you've unlocked, stuff like that, albeit, again, starting with 30 energy. And while continue codes are certainly nothing all that unusual for the era, Metroids are 20 characters. So it takes you a while to input them, and you're starting with 30 energy and not even exactly where you left off. That gets thoroughly irritating, and these days basically means that if you're going to be playing this game, you almost certainly aren't going to be doing it on original NES or Famicom hardware. You are going to be playing one of these subsequent re-releases that includes the ability to create save states or suspend points, whatever terminology the system uses. That way you can skip the code entry system entirely and just load up your suspend point and actually pick up where exactly you left off. And while suspend points can mitigate some of the issues revolving around the continue system and the energy grinding mechanic, they don't do a thing for the almost complete lack of direction this game gives you. You see, whenever you find a new suit ability, or a new weapon for your arm cannon, or, say, an energy tank, the game tells you absolutely nothing about it. You just pick it up, it plays a music stinger, and then that's it. You just continue on your merry way. If you want to actually know what it is you're picking up and how to use it, you have to consult the manual. And if you don't have the manual, well, guess you're up for some trial and error figuring out exactly what it is, what it does, and how to use it. And speaking of the game's manual, if you want to know who you are, what you're doing, and why you're doing it, you also need to consult the manual, because quite literally the only storyline you get in the game itself, at least until you get to the very, very end of the game and you finish it and you get your ending blurb, is emergency order: defeat the Metroid of the planet Zabeth and destroy the Mother Brain, the mechanical life vein. That's it. That's all the story the game itself actually gives you. And funnily enough, calling it the planet Zabeth isn't even correct, because all the subsequent games that reference it call it Zebes. Which of course brings me to a linguistic quirk with Japanese that, honestly, I think I'm just going to make an entire video about, because I'm a language nerd and it's a fun thing to talk about, so I'm going to do that in a completely separate video. But all you really need to know for the purposes of the original Metroid is the original katakana for the planet, the characters it's written in, is Zebesu, which is to say the characters Ze and then a dash representing an elongated A sound at the end of Ze, followed by Be, and then Su. And the Su at the end of that could represent one of three different sounds. It could actually be Su, or it could be a stand-in for a TH sound, because Japanese does not have a TH sound, or it could be a stand-in for just ending on an S sound, because Japanese also does not have the basic consonant S by itself. It is a syllabic language rather than a phonetic language. Again, this is for the subject of the other video I'm probably going to do. But anyway, the original translator of Metroid thought that the Su at the end was a TH sound. They later changed that to just an S sound by itself as of Metroid 2, and it's been the same ever since. So yeah, if you don't have the manual, then the only story you get in this thing is the game telling you to defeat the Metroid on the planet Zebes, and to destroy the Mother Brain, which is apparently the mechanical life vein, whatever that's supposed to mean. If you do actually have access to the manual, then you will have a much better idea of who you are and what you're doing, because it actually explains it, although, funnily enough, it does refer to Samus as male. And interestingly enough, this is not a mistranslation. In the original Japanese manual, it refers to Samus as male. It was a deliberate choice because there is a secret ending in the game, which obviously isn't a secret anymore. It's been so long that everybody knows this. But when you beat the game and it gets to the end screen showing you the congratulations, you have fulfilled your mission. Yeah, because it's badly translated too. But anyway, it shows the screen, it gives you the text blurb, and it shows Samus standing there, and depending on how quickly you've beaten the game, then Samus' sprite changes, and you end up with less and less of the power suit remaining. Eventually you end up with no power suit at all, and you can tell that she is in fact a woman, and if you beat the game in less than an hour, she's standing there in a bikini. Now obviously this doesn't affect the story of the game, which is basically non-existent. It doesn't affect the gameplay of it. It doesn't really have any actual effect on the game whatsoever, really, other than just being a neat historical quirk of the game. And it only applies to the original, because once that reveal happened, well, there was no point in hiding it anymore, so every subsequent game in the series makes absolutely no attempt to hide the fact that Samus is a woman. But the idea of slightly different endings depending on how you finish the game did actually get retained throughout the rest of the series as a sort of tradition, so it did have at least some lasting impact beyond being just a cheap reveal at the end is like, hey, by the way, Samus is a woman, isn't that neat? Anyway, I've gone off on a bit of a tangent there, but to bring it back around to what I was originally saying here, the game itself gives you basically nothing to go off of, so you just have to bumble your way through it if you don't have access to the manual, or a guide or something of the sort in order to be able to steer yourself through it. And that just compounds on top of all the issues that I have mentioned previously to make the original Metroid an incredibly frustrating experience to play through. And it's going to be something that you're going to have an extremely difficult time getting into unless you happen to play it back in the day and can push through it with the nostalgia you feel for it. Or if you are just an aficionado of very old platformers. Because the simple reality is that everything that makes this game frustrating was addressed in subsequent entries in the series. And while less of it was addressed in Metroid 2, by the time you get to Metroid 3, aka Super Metroid, pretty much everything that was wrong with the original Metroid had been addressed. It is a vastly superior game in every conceivable metric. And this isn't simply the, oh, well, sequels should obviously improve upon what the original did. No, this is to the point where the original becomes practically unplayable by comparison, and it is such a stark difference that when people tell you that you should try Metroid, they basically are never referring to the original Metroid. They are referring to Super Metroid onwards. In fact, if you ask Metroid fans which one you should start playing, they will almost certainly tell you to start with Super Metroid, and they will probably outright tell you to avoid the original Metroid, not least of which because the original Metroid got remade as Metroid Zero Mission, which addresses every single problem this game has and is a vastly superior experience to it. Which of course means that while the original Metroid definitely holds a place in gaming history as the progenitor of basically an entire subgenre of games, there's unfortunately just not much of a reason to play it these days unless you are specifically going into it because you have nostalgia for it, or because you are specifically going in for the historical value and don't really mind that you're probably not going to enjoy it. It's a situation where not only is it a product of its time, but subsequent entries in the series have rendered it completely obsolete, not least of which because there was a full remake of the game that completely expands upon everything and addresses every single problem that the original game had, meaning that if you're just looking to play the original Metroid to experience the origins of Samus, then you'd really just be better served playing Metroid Zero Mission. And if you're looking to play the earliest Metroid game that is still eminently playable, then you're probably going to jump into Super Metroid because it is an eminently more playable experience than the original Metroid is. And that covers everything I wanted to say about the original Metroid. I imagine that I'll be able to find a lot more positive to say about later entries in the series, starting with Super Metroid compared to this, but the original Metroid is just a very rough experience to go back to, especially if you don't have nostalgia to push you through the entire thing. So hopefully when I get around to covering those, it'll be a much smoother experience in terms of actual video production, and hopefully I won't need to sit there and ramble for 20 plus minutes about the amount of problems the game has. But of course, we'll get there when we get there. I'll have to go through Metroid 2, The Return of Samus first, but I'm not entirely sure what type of video that's going to be yet, so we'll know what happens when we get there. And then finally with Super Metroid, I do expect to be able to do a classic review of that. And then after that, things get a bit messier because Metroid Fusion and Metroid Prime released on the same day. So unlike with, say, the Zelda series, where I kind of have to mix the 2D and 3D entries together because those games tend to borrow from each other and the release orders all spread out with them, the Metroid series just splits in 2002 into the 2D entries and the 3D entries, and I'm pretty sure that most of my audience is much more interested in what I have to say about the Prime sub-series versus the 2D games, so chances are, once I get past Super Metroid, I'm just going to go straight into the Prime games, and then I'll end up catching up on the 2D entries later. So keep an eye out for all that in the future. Now, to address an elephant in the room, what is going on with Request Month? Because obviously that has gone horribly wrong, and I have been trying and obviously failing to catch up on that over the ensuing couple of months. So the way this is going to work, I am still going to cover the games that I originally intended to cover during Request Month. Now, I'm hoping I can get the next one out in a much quicker fashion than this Metroid video has taken, and from there, video production will hopefully resume a more steady pace as opposed to this massive gap that has existed for months now. As for the questions and answers video, as I mentioned in my post on the channel, I decided to keep accepting questions for that up until I have completed the final review that I planned for Request Month this year, at which point I will make an announcement both in the video and in just a post on my channel that will specify when the new cutoff for questions is. At that point, I will no longer accept any questions for this year's Q&A, and I'll work on getting that Q&A video done as soon as possible. It will probably still take a while because it's the kind of video that I will work on in between projects. So I'll focus on reviews, MTOs, that kind of thing, and I'll just record a question or two at a time in the middle of doing all this stuff until eventually I've got the whole Q&A recorded, at which point I edit the video together and get it compiled and uploaded. So the window to submit questions is still open, so if you have a question that you want me to answer in the upcoming Q&A, go ahead and submit that question, and if you do so before when the Q&A cutoff ends up being, then it will get included in this year's Q&A. If it's past that date, then it'll be included in whatever the next Q&A is, unless it's something that I wouldn't be answering anyway. Details on what kind of stuff I won't be answering are, of course, in the announcement video for Request Month and the Q&A. Now then, with all of that said, thank you all very much for watching this video, for sticking with me to the end, and also for your patience over the past several months as I've been struggling to find time and energy to work on videos. It's either been things that have just been occupying all of my time and energy that are completely unrelated to the channel, or I've been interrupted by bouts of illness that have made it so I can't really record anything, or I have been interrupted by noise that's made it impossible to record things. And at one point I was so busy I couldn't even get on my computer at all for several days, so even aside from working on videos, I couldn't do things like respond to messages for several days, and things got piled up pretty badly there. So it's been a mess, and I greatly appreciate your patience while I've been working through all of that stuff. Here's hoping things have calmed down enough to where I can resume a regular schedule of video production, even if it's a lightened schedule, so maybe one video a week or something like that. Unfortunately, with the way things have been going, I can't really make any guarantees with that, but that's the hope at least. So again, very much appreciate your patience, very much appreciate your support. Thank you all very much for watching and staying with me throughout this whole ramble, and I will see you all in later videos.